In the 1980s, following the new Hollywood movement of the 70s and the rise of the blockbuster, the door was left open for the next wave of exciting new voices in film. And the people that walked through that door weren't looking to work within the Hollywood system as their predecessors had, but rather outside of it, often on low budgets in the hopes of pushing the envelope of what cinematic craft and storytelling could be. From coast to coast, filmmakers gathered their resources and put everything they had into these gritty, sometimes silly, but always memorable films that helped define the decade. Put on your scrunchies and pull up your leg warmers. This is 80s Indies.
Hello and welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And today on the show, we're going to be discussing Abel Ferrara's 1981 film, Miss 45.
Every day, on every street, in every city, women are insulted, abused, threatened.
Nana, what's the matter?
What's the matter with you?
Miss 45 is a 1981 film directed by Abel Ferrara that follows the story of Thana, played by Zoe Tamerlis, also known as Zoe Lund, a mute garment worker who is raped twice on the same day and goes on a violent revenge spree against reprehensible men.
Yes. So we are in the Garment Center in Manhattan in this film. And you don't see many films set in this specific section of New York. I've realized that when I was watching this. It's very specific. And when we were originally discussing what series we'd like to talk about, we had discussed doing possibly New York indies because so many great cult indie films take place there. But ultimately, we wanted to open up to some other films that we wanted to talk about and focus instead on a particular era in indie films. And Jeremy, I feel like both you and I are fascinated by independent films and filmmakers for obvious reasons because we're involved with filmmaking, and I think it's a cool idea to look at them at certain time periods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always interesting. I think what makes the 80s a particularly interesting time is that it's kind of sandwiched between what most people consider to be almost kind of golden ages of Hollywood cinema. You have the 70s New Hollywood movement, and then you have the 90s kind of Sundance generation filmmakers who are pretty widely, obviously everyone has their own opinions, but by many people considered to be two of the most progressive, exciting film movements that have kind of ever happened. And then in the middle, you have this kind of disparate movement of 80s filmmakers from all over the place. I know, Mark, we were discussing ahead of time that, obviously there were a lot of great New York films, which is exciting, but these films really came from all over the place.
Yeah, definitely. And we got to talk about lots of different types of filmmakers, which we don't normally get to in this in our show. And one of them is Abel Ferrara, and he's someone that I would like to do a series on actually in the future because he's just such an interesting filmmaker and character in his own right. So this film, Miss 45, is his second feature film after The Driller Killer in 1979, which is another really wild film. And I think we may return to that one if we ever do our Video Nasty series.
Yes. Highly recommend.
Yeah, that movie is great. And actually watching this film, Miss 45, made me want to rewatch that movie again. And that was his first film, although he did actually make a film before that, which, we already said a disclaimer here, so let's just go ahead and say the title of that one. That would be 9 Lives of a Wet Pussy. So that was a adult film that he is actually under a different name. He's listed under Jimmy Boy L. And his regular writer, Nicholas St. John, who also wrote this film and many others of his, also wrote that film under Nicholas George. So that was technically their first film, 1976, but his first, I guess you'd call legitimate film or however you want to look at it, was The Driller Killer, and then followed by this film, which is Miss 45 in 1981. And this film is I guess you could call it a vigilante or revenge film. It might be the first one like that we've talked about on this show. Exploitation thriller, I guess you could also call it. And Apparently, it was inspired by films such as Death Wish and Taxi Driver, which I think you can plainly
Yeah.
see. Also, I thought of I Spit on Your Grave. I don't know if you saw that one, Jeremy.
It's been on my list forever, but it's
Yeah.
one of those movies where I know what it's about, and it's hard to get myself in the mindset to want to watch it. But
Yeah, it's also like if you know what it's about, you kind of know already what's going to
Yeah.
happen. But it's if you're a fan of exploitation or that type of film, it's it's an interesting watch.
canon.
And yeah, and so this film, I guess because of its subject matter, was critically detested on its release, Miss 45, but it has since gone on to be highly regarded among fans of underground and independent film, and obviously fans of Abel Ferrara, the director. And I would say it's definitely one of the more disturbing films that we've talked about because of the subject matter on this show. And but I mean, how did most of it sit with you? Is it now? This was not your first time seeing it, right, Jeremy? You've seen this film before.
yeah, no, I had seen this
Yeah.
film before. I think it worked differently for me this time than the first time I saw it. I
Yeah.
think in a more interesting way. The first time I saw it, and as we mentioned, this story kind of starts with this young lady who is mute, and has this actress. Zoe Tamerlis. One of the things I just am so impressed with is how much she was able to communicate without any dialogue, and
Yeah.
also she kind of, for the most part, actually had a very reserved acting style. She could really communicate a lot with her eyes. But as we mentioned, the character that she's playing very on in the story suffers these two very violent rapes, one of which ends with the perpetrator getting away. The other ends with her violently murdering the rapist. So we kind of see these two different juxtaposed traumatic scenarios that she goes through, and obviously the second one, she gets some kind of vindication from fighting back and likes that feeling and decides to keep rolling with it. And I think the first time I watched this film, I saw it more as a revenge film, which obviously is a big part of it. But watching the film now, I looked at it. I was able to pick up a lot more on kind of the traumatic aspects of it, and how throughout the film it wasn't like this isn't like a Tarantino revenge film where something happens and the person is like, I'm going to get revenge at all costs, and they're going after
Yeah.
one specific target. This
Kind
is
of like winking at the camera or anything like that.
yeah, this is kind of more just
Something
like
that.
a person has been broken and just can't
Yeah.
take it anymore. And I thought some of the stuff early on in the film that Ferrara did to establish her sense of dread, her sense of fear, and those memories, like the quick little cuts to the rapist's face, which interestingly enough was actually played by Abel Ferrara, the first
By Abel
one.
Ferrara. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like you mentioned Quentin Tarantino. I think that's a good comparison to make. And this film, it's just much more. I see it as more like voyeuristic almost. That we're kind of just following her and in her life and what's happening to her. So I'm going to go through the main beats of the film. But before I do that, I want to talk about the silent protagonist, because that's a huge part of this movie. So Thana works in the garment industry as a seamstress, I believe, or just in some way with these garments. And there's something about a silent or mostly silent protagonist to me that is very engaging. I was actually reminded of Ryan Gosling's character in Drive as one example of that. And some people either kind of love it or hate it, I guess, but I find it, like I said, engaging. And I think because it makes the audience kind of wonder what's going on behind their eyes or inside their mind. So in ways like that, I find it more engaging. But how did you think that... First of all, how do you think it worked in the film? And secondly, why do you think he chose to have a silent protagonist in the film?
I think it worked really, really well. I was with this character the whole time, and like I said before, that actress can just express, so much with just her
great.
eyes and a single little look. So yeah, but I don't know. For me, I think I thinking about it and kind of, and I can't speak obviously to why the director and writer would make that decision. But for me, what was so interesting about her being silent the whole time is that you kind of, the only voices you get are these men who are kind of harassing her throughout. You don't really, I mean, you hear her coworkers kind of talking, but it's normally pretty lighthearted. They're joking around a lot. But like the one scene I'm thinking of specifically is there's a scene, I want to say it's about the halfway point maybe, when she goes to a diner with some of her coworkers, and there's a guy there that's kind of, her coworkers leave, and this guy is hitting on her, and and he just won't leave her alone. And she's not responding to anything he's saying, and he just keeps talking and talking and talking
Right.
and talking, and it's just like because you're with her, and even though she's doing, some really violent things in this film, although because it's through her point of view, they feel justified within the world of the film. But it's like the way she just kind of stands there and takes it, and it's just listening and listening and listening, and you can just feel that sense of dread that like but
oppression. It's like almost like very oppressive.
Yeah, because
all these voices coming at her. Yeah,
and you almost get the feeling that even if she could speak, it would be ignored. And for me, that's kind of why she's silent in this. It's to make a statement.
You think it's like symbolic almost?
Yeah, it's almost like the voice, the only voice she has is her 45. It is the gun. It is the violence. It's like because the kind response, the kind shrugging off isn't working because these men just keep coming back to her, and keep harassing her. But so the only way she can deal with it is to get violent and loud, which is interesting. Just thinking about the nature of protest and revolution is a lot of the time it's like you see peaceful protest, the peaceful silent protest, which to me is kind of where she starts out the film, and by the end she's rioting, for lack of a better term.
Right. She kind of takes a journey there. Yeah, definitely. I thought the silent protagonist idea really worked well in this film, much like you did. And also I thought it allowed for a more surreal cutting, like the editing of the film, and a more stylistic approach overall, and some really strong imagery as well. So I think he used that because not only for the symbolic nature of it, but I think it just allowed him to do so many things filmmaking wise, and acting as well. Like you said, she's so good in the film and carries it almost entirely with just her face and the look in her eyes. So it's really interesting. And so the film, the journey we go on with her kind of starts with her at work in the garment section of New York, and she goes home or is walking home, and there's a mugger who's also a rapist who's in this really creepy clear mask that slightly distorts his face, and it makes what is already a disturbing scene, I thought, even more disturbing. And like you said, Jeremy, apparently that was Ferrara himself in the mask. And so that happens and is very disturbing. And then she comes home and it happens again. But this time, someone's actually in her apartment with her. And this time she also fights back. And she ends up bashing this assailant over the head. I forget what she uses to do that. She kind of just reaches.
I believe it's an iron.
Well,
a clothing
she
iron.
does use an iron.
Yeah.
First, I think it's something else, but then
right.
she does
It's like some kind of like apple.
That iron.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that she just grabbed, and but she finishes him off with this iron, and that imagery of the iron would come back later in the film as well when she's working with one and using the same thing, and she kind of thinks back to that, and that was a nice little moment, I thought. So eventually, this leads to her cutting up the body because now she has a dead body on her hands. Putting it in the bathtub, wrapping up the body parts in newspaper in order to get rid of them. So she's kind of off on her little journey here, and starts carrying a gun around with her, a 45, of course. And I don't know if they mentioned where she gets the gun or if I just missed that. But
I believe it was the guy in the apartment. He had a gun on him.
Oh, right. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So she takes the assailant's gun, the 45, and she starts to take a more, I guess you could call it, preemptive approach to dealing with these city scumbags that she runs into. And it starts off, kind of like almost a revenge fantasy type film, exploitation film, where she is literally taking to the streets with this firearm, and she's just kind of taking things into her own hands. And I think it's for the first time she feels control over the situation. And I think that eventually kind of goes to her head. But in the beginning, it's seen more as like a defensive thing. And also the path that she goes on. Now, I've never seen it, although I've always meant to watch it. But Dexter, have you seen that show?
I haven't.
So I know the premise of Dexter, and it kind of reminds me of that, where someone who exclusively, so in Dexter, he exclusively murders serial killers. And in this, this is kind of like the sort of vigilante who they feel that their methods and deeds are justified in some way. And in this case, this is someone who's been done wrong. I think twice in one day that'll make anyone snap in a certain way. And so, this is kind of what she decides to start doing, is going around and taking care of these men in her own way. There's one really poignant scene early on where she writes a note to one of her friends, one of her coworkers, and she writes, "I just wish they would leave me alone." Yeah. And I thought that was like really, even though she doesn't have any dialogue really in the film, I thought that was really a strong line to take from it. So shortly after this, she has another encounter, and a man on the street approaches her, propositions her to make the big bucks, as he says, takes her back to his place, and this does not go well for him. We see that he's a photographer with this white backdrop, and immediately this backdrop is painted red with his blood. Thana shoots him without even stepping out of the elevator. So she's pretty determined by this point. These men are not going to mess with her. So she's, really, but at this point, it could still be seen as defensive, maybe. But I think at some point it does take that turn where she's almost just hunting these people or looking for reasons, maybe. Did you get that kind of trajectory, though? When you watched it, Jeremy?
Well, I think what it kind of becomes is, like you said, it's almost like a preemptive thing where she's coming across these people and she's seeing them, do these like little small actions and is saying, this person who's willing to do this little thing could easily turn into someone, like who could do one of those bigger terrible things. And
part of it is justified because of what happened to her. And what that can do to a person's, inner psyche, obviously, can be tremendous. So you do sympathize with her in that regard, and that actually makes me think of. I've been thinking a lot about the anti-hero, just for my own like writing projects and things like that. I've been kind of doing research on them and why audiences sympathize with them and root for them. I find it very interesting, the psychology of that, and how do you see Thana in the pantheon of sympathetic yet extremely flawed protagonists? Do you see her fitting that kind of anti-hero mold, I guess?
Yeah, totally. I think it's interesting because she works in a different way than most anti-heroes normally do, because I feel like a lot of the time you meet the anti-hero and they're kind of an anti-hero from the beginning. They kind of already have...
Like Tony Soprano is like the big example.
Yeah, exactly.
Walter
or like
White from Breaking Bad.
Or we mentioned like Tarantino before. It's like in pretty much all of his revenge films, those people are already equipped for killing. They're already have had life experience and fight. Whereas with her, it seems like she kind of it's almost like what is it, like the Killing Joke, where they talk about there's the line like if anyone could have one bad day.
Yeah.
Or something like that. It's kind of like that, where it's like it seems like this is a person who is a little bit on edge to begin with, but doesn't seem like a violent person. She seems like she says she just wants to be left alone. She wants to be able to just move through her life. But when her life is infringed upon and her her personal space, her body is infringed upon, she just that's the one really terrible day, and from that point there's no going back. So it is interesting because I have a hard time almost calling her an anti-hero, because I understand the anger the whole time. It's obviously she goes about it in the most extreme way, which is also which is one thing I was wondering. And a movie like this, I think it's hard to take the story at face value. I really don't think.
Yeah, it's almost more like a fable or like a
because it's just so explosive. It almost seems on some level like a fantasy, like if someone who doesn't have a voice, if they could just at one time just express it.
Exactly.
So that's why there was no point. The only time when for me she kind of felt like an anti-hero, there was one very brief scene where she's walking around the city and she sees a couple and they're making out. But they seem to be a pretty happy couple, They seem to be having fun, and you kind of get the sense like they split up. The guy says goodnight, the girl says goodnight, and she follows the guy home, and you kind of get the sense that she's gonna like hunt this guy, but like it seems like the guy was being pretty sweet and caring and nice to his girlfriend, and so like that was the only point for me where she kind of until the very end of the film where she kind of became an anti-hero, because it's like she. Like, if he had stayed out a little longer, would she have crossed that line and killed this guy who had really done nothing worse than enjoying the company of his girlfriend?
Well, even at the point of the photographer, when he invites her back to his apartment, even that could be seen as where she makes her turn, because
Yeah.
depending on how you look at it. But because how extreme is extreme, like, so yeah. But it's a little bit up for debate. But I totally agree with you, Jeremy. I think this movie is very much in your face. I think it's very extreme, with a purpose. I think they did that for a reason.
Yeah.
It's almost like hyper realistic, and because of that, you can see it more as like a fable or sort of very dark fairy tale, which I guess most fairy tales are dark anyway, at their core, or the origins of them. So yeah, that is kind of what this movie is, and I think a lot of it is very extreme, and I think that was done on purpose. And I think, but yeah, it's hard to say exactly where that turn is made, but I think it is hard to call her an anti-hero because she does take that turn.
Yeah.
And I am reminded of Taxi Driver, with Robert De Niro's character, because by the end of it, you just feel bad for him, but you kind of are sickened by him also, because of what he's done. So there is a point now. At this point in the film, Thana starts wearing more makeup. She starts dressing differently, so she takes a noticeable change in her appearance, and I think that's symbolic as well.
Yeah. Before we move on with that, I just want to make a note, because I just thought the makeup in this movie was phenomenal.
Oh, great.
And I looked up the makeup artist is a woman named Lisa Monteleone, I believe that's how it's said, or Monteleone, and this was the only film she ever did.
Really?
Yeah, which I just thought was really interesting, because she did a phenomenal job. Like this, like to me, when I think of this movie, the first thing I think of are like the big pouty lips, and like it's kind of like it's almost like she's almost like cartoonishly made up in this very 80s Vogue new wave way, and it's just so rich and like, I don't know,
very stylish,
stylish, very and I don't know. So it's just, I just wanted to, in case she never gets talked about in any other context, just shout her out, because she did a tremendous
job. And by the time you get to the ending with when she's wearing the nun wardrobe with the lipstick and everything, definitely. So just to kind of, I'm not going to like go over every beat of the story, but just to kind of briefly go over what happens from this point on. So she takes to the streets, and she actually takes out a pimp who's beating up on one of his prostitutes in the street. So that's like almost like a crime fighter kind of thing, a superhero,
the Batman
kind of. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would not be out of line for Batman, although I guess. Well, I don't think she actually kills him or anything. So, actually, does she shoot him? I forget.
I believe she does. I believe she does. Yeah.
All right. So Batman wouldn't do that, but but the same idea is behind it, right?
The principles.
So, right, exactly. She actually takes on a whole street gang, so she is kind of like Batman. After this, she's kind of surrounded by this gang, and
with nunchucks. So, one of them has nunchucks.
Exactly. It kind of feels like a scene out of, like, I don't know, Ninja Turtles or something. But
I think in New York in 1980, just like half the people had nunchucks, just walking around. That's just kind of how it was back then, right?
That's just how it was, exactly. So, and then from there, she gets into a limousine. She ends up killing the people that are inside the limousine, including the driver. That scene feels very surreal to me, because it kind of comes out of nowhere almost. And then there's the meat grinder. She, the landlord's dog is starting to sniff around in the apartment, so she wants to take care of that. So she grinds up the bodies, I guess the parts of the bodies that she still has, and feeds it to the landlady's dog. And so that's just kind of like almost like a very darkly funny moment there. There's a scene I do want to talk about where she meets a man in a bar and listens to him tell a story about a woman who he felt wronged him, so he killed her cat. Yeah. And it's very interesting, because she goes to shoot him right after he tells his story, but the gun doesn't fire. And he takes it and puts it to his own head, and he does it to himself. And I found this an oddly powerful scene. Do you think what do you think the meaning behind this scene was? Because it's almost very different than any other scene in the movie.
I mean, it is really weird, because it's like, that could even work as a short film in a weird way, like just that part. The tone would be, because it's a really tragic and like. And
it has like a beginning, middle, and end in that one sequence.
Yeah, and the actor who played that guy did a great job, just in expressing that, like, the melancholy and the misery. It was just, I don't know, something about that scene. Like you said, it's kind of like hauntingly tragic. Like you're going through and it's a violent movie, it's a parable, and you're getting that, but then you kind of hit that scene and it turns into something like just like genuinely like deeply human, but not in like a nice way, like in like a Like you feel like you kind of get like punched in the soul in a really
Yeah.
nasty way. You just feel kind of like gross and tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And like when he takes the gun, and it's just such a brutal thing to watch.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because the way the way the film's presented, like it's like you have these brutal events that happen to her at the beginning, and you have all these guys getting killed, and the way they're killed is brutal, but like you don't really necessarily feel bad for these guys. It's just kind of part of the movie. But like him, you feel bad for. Like that guy, you feel real sympathy for.
Exactly.
It's just a really kind of tragic tale.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was the reason they put it in there, because they wanted to show you like maybe a different side of one of these characters that she's plans on killing, at least. So yeah, it's a very interesting scene, and even just taken out of context, I think it's really powerful. And then from there, we see her, the main character Thana, take her landlady's dog out to the river, and she does point a gun at it, and you don't really see what happens. It cuts away. And then from there, we kind of move on to the climax of the film, which is the office Halloween party, which is we've kind of been building up to throughout the film. And this is when Thana dresses as a nun. And there's something about a nun with lipstick and a gun that's just like, I don't know, something, just some striking imagery there. Yeah, it's really kind of almost iconic, I guess, of this film. You can't really think of it without thinking of that image. And I think that image was on a lot of the posters and things like that.
Her with the nun costume.
Yeah, the nun costume and the makeup and everything. And the gun, of course.
Yeah.
So her boss ends up taking her to the party, and he escorts her there for one reason or another. I think he kind of holds something against her earlier on. And then from there, he takes her into the back room. And meanwhile, her landlady has found a severed head in Thana's apartment and is reporting her to detectives about her dog, because now she fears that her dog has been murdered by her. And she tells them about the office party, and that's where they can find her. So this is where the massacre begins. And right now I want to talk about slow motion. So this is going to be a little bit of a Mark rant here, but so I see the technique of slow motion. I see it used so much in current films. To me, it is one of the most overused film techniques, to where it loses a lot of its appeal and relevancy. That's just an observation on my part. I mean, mostly like, big Hollywood superhero films and the big special effects films, you see a real overuse of slow motion. In my mind, anyways, is how I see it. But in this film here, in this scene, it makes so much sense and is perfect for the climax of this film. And especially with the slowed down audio effects, the strobing lights that are going off, you can really feel that Thana has truly descended into hell. And you feel each hit of the bullet, you feel it. And it's a little reminiscent also of the ending of Carrie, although instead of a prom and psychic powers, it's a Halloween party and a nun with a gun. But so yeah, that scene is kind of like I said, the climax of the film. She comes out of the room after murdering her boss and proceeds to just kind of shoot all the men in the room. And these are men that are just standing around. So again, it's like, they may not have even done anything wrong, and she's just kind of taking their lives. So she is definitely taking a turn by this point. And then ultimately she is stabbed from behind, and she turns and sees that it's a woman. It's actually her co-worker, Lori, who we had seen earlier in the film. And apparently she's picked up a cake cutting knife. And she stabs her, and before Thana falls, she says her only line of dialogue in the film, which is "sister," and she just screams it. And I actually had to watch it again because I couldn't. Yeah, sister. And the movie ends with the dog returning. So she did not kill the dog, which is always good.
Always
any
good.
movie when the dog does not die.
Yeah.
So maybe she is an anti-hero because she didn't kill the dog.
Yeah.
But that moment's kind of shocking too when she turns and sees that it's a woman, and she kind of is conflicted. You see it all in her face again with the acting there. And she just kind of pauses, and that's when, that's when it's all over for her. But I mean, do you see that as a fitting ending for her character, I guess?
Yeah, I think just that sense of betrayal is just so kind of profound there. Like, to me at least, the look look she gives. Was the coworker's name Lori? You said
Lori, yeah.
And there's got to be a Lori in every single 80s.
I
horror
swear, yeah.
slasher.
When I saw that, I was like,
must
of
have been
course, right?
Yeah, sorry for that tangent, but I swear it's like you watch any '80s movie, there's always a Lori. But yeah,
Right.
I think it's kind of this moment where she's looking at her like, you know, don't you understand? Don't you have these experiences too?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
and you know, which is interesting, you know, because it's like we talk about, you know, any kind of wrongdoing in our culture, there's generally someone enabling it. It's not happening in a
Mm-hmm.
bubble. So to me,
Yeah.
that's kind of that moment. Like, you know, we understand Laurie's point of view too, because it's like you're hanging out at a Halloween party and one of your coworkers starts shooting a bunch of people. It's not an
Right.
unreasonable response to stop them. I would say it's the most reasonable response, but it is just that look for a moment from Thana where it's just like she's just like it's almost like the et tu brute, you know, like and you like you
Yeah.
would do this too to
Mm-hmm.
me, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like no one is here to look out for me, no one would protect me, you know,
Mm-hmm.
no one would understand, and it goes back I think to that idea of her being silent, you know, it's like
Yeah.
no one's gonna listen, you know,
Mm-hmm.
even in the beginning, and I think that's maybe part of it is like I think Lori, if I'm correct, was the one she handed the note to, right? That said,
I
I just
believe
want to be
so.
left
I
alone.
believe so.
So
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
for me, that moment is kind of like you understand. I just want to be left alone,
Yeah.
and you've been sitting here watching while this guy takes me to this
Mm-hmm.
party, while all these people are like standing around talking to me and harassing me, and then after all that, you literally stab me in the back. It's like that's you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah. She does
it's
literally
kind of like a
stab her.
guilty by
Yeah.
association thing. She literally
Mm-hmm.
stabs her
Yeah.
in the
Definitely.
back. So it's kind of I think
Yeah.
for me it's kind of like a guilty by association. Like how could you do that?
Yeah.
Which
Mm-hmm.
obviously as an audience we see it, maybe we understand her point of view. We also, like we said before, maybe see it a little differently because she walked
Yeah.
into a party of an office party more or less and just shot a bunch of people.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
you know,
But it does leave you with a lot to think about. I will say that. And Zoe Lund Tamerlis, because she went by her married name towards the end of her life, she did have a very unfortunately short career and life. She was only 17 at the time of filming Miss 45, which is kind of phenomenal too. That she was able to pull off such a great performance at such a young age. But I think because she is so young in the film, it also adds to it. But she she was sort of a collaborator with Abel Ferrara, the director. She co-wrote the script for, and actually had a supporting role in Ferrara's crime drama Bad Lieutenant, which is a big film of his that he did later. And she plays a drug addict in that film, and she was a drug addict in real life. She was actually a very staunch advocate for heroin. She loved heroin. Many quotes I saw about her from friends were just about how much she like it was not only a love of heroin, it was actually her lifestyle. She just lived for it. And ultimately, well, actually, ironically, it wasn't even heroin. It was, I believe, an overdose of cocaine that actually
yeah,
caused her heart failure at the age of 37 was when she died
yeah,
in 1999. So she didn't do too much else artistically. I think she had some short stories that she was working on, some novels and things like that. But her career, she had a very interesting, albeit short career. And I actually was looking. Abel Ferrara had a quote about her that was just kind of like, it was sort of sad. He just said something like, let me see here. Oh, yes, she said, or I'm sorry, Abel Ferrara in 2012 interview, he said Zoe was a brilliant, creative person before the drugs, and the drugs just killed her. So, I think they had a really good working relationship, and then things kind of soured. And oddly enough, the writer of this film went on a similar trajectory. It seems like with Abel Ferrara as a writing partner, or as a producing partner, and things like that. And his name is Nicholas St. John, is what he went by, and he's also an interesting character because he actually went to high school with Abel Ferrara, so they were longtime friends, and they were longtime collaborators up until the mid '90s. And he worked on him with many of his very memorable films, from Driller Killer. He worked with him up until like Body Snatchers, Dangerous Game, the Funeral. So through many of his films, although he did not work on Bad Lieutenant, oddly enough, because he was a devout Catholic and saw that film as kind of blasphemous, I guess, or reprehensible, which is to me ironic for someone who worked on a film called Nine Lives of a Wet Pussy, but to each their own. So I find
yeah.
that kind of interesting, and a lot of people think that's why he stopped working with Abel Ferrara. People think that they had some sort of falling out. That's never really been detailed, but maybe just because of different reasons, subject matter or things like that. Because eventually he did stop working. They did stop working together. But he did write a lot of his early films, a lot of Abel Ferrara's early films, and I thought we should give him a shout out.
Including his Nine Lives film, his very first.
Exactly, his very first film. But yeah, Abel Ferrara said that the business just didn't really jibe with him. Also, so I guess he just had some qualms with it, which is understandable. So at a certain point, he just left, and he left at the top of his game, I guess you could look at it. So yeah, and this film, once again, like I said, ironically, he was opposed to the one film because I feel like a lot of these films are pretty gritty and pretty exploitative. And this film, when it was released on VHS in 1983 in its uncut form, but when it was released on DVD in 2000, there were edits made to censor mostly the rape scenes, but also some violence at the end with the Halloween party. And but thankfully, the uncut version has now been released on DVD, Blu-ray, and digital, so you can view the uncut version of the film, which is always good, in my opinion. But yeah, this film, it's definitely an Abel Ferrara film, but it's definitely an early Abel Ferrara film. We talked about The Driller Killer, Jeremy, and how that film was definitely more of like a slasher horror thriller kind of film. And this film is in that same vein, kind of taking it to the next level, I thought. I'm not sure how you see this film compared to other Abel Ferrara films that you've seen. But I think it still has that same kind of street level, genuine feel that a lot of his movies have, that grittiness that I was talking about. Like I said, these early films are a little more horror, a little more thriller. And then he would go on to do films like we mentioned Bad Lieutenant and King of New York, films like that. So, but how do you think this film, I guess, compares to other Abel Ferrara films and other, independent films from this era, I guess?
I mean, yeah, I've only seen a handful of Abel Ferrara films. I haven't seen all of his work. This one, honestly, I'd probably say is my favorite. Not necessarily favorite writing and story-wise, but just kind of the gritty feel of it. I love this particular version of New York City that's presented in this film. I feel like he really captured tone. Also, that was one thing I was thinking about as you were talking before, is how this film, it wasn't received as well right when it was released. It kind of took a little while to gain its, as we're hearing, cult following.
Film. Right.
And I think part of that might be that New York City doesn't exist anymore. And the fact that, if you go to New York City today, if you go to the Garment District, it doesn't feel like that. Like there are buildings. I used to work over in that neighborhood. There specifically there was one scene that was, I think, when she puts the body in the garbage can, and it's on Fifth Avenue and 19th Street, and I believe I recognize the building, and I'm pretty sure that building currently is an H&M. So it's just like that New York. If I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's the building. And that New York doesn't exist anymore, which to me adds so much to the tone of this film, because it's like it's just this gritty feeling that like everything
New York
is kind of dangerous.
New York was so much grittier back then, I guess.
Much grittier, yeah. I know. I mean, even like walking, this was the pre, Disney-fication of Times Square. This is, this is like the Taxi Driver in New York. But in a way, to me, because this is a lower budget film, this New York actually, to me, almost felt grittier than Taxi Driver. To me, the characters of Taxi Driver maybe felt a little grittier because they were maybe developed, or not maybe, they were developed in a more interesting way. And, I think Scorsese has a way of working with actors and kind of getting these performances. And, and there's certain things in this film, like, I wasn't a huge fan of the landlady character. She kind of bugged me.
I can see that.
So there were certain things in this film that I think kind of maybe pulled back a little bit, but I think that just that raw, gritty essence of New York is part of what makes this parable work so well. The other thing that I really wanted to note was, I believe, I don't know if it's Delia or Delia, but Joe Delia is the composer, the musician who did the music for this film.
Oh, yeah.
And I love the music for this film. It is so cool.
Same.
It is so of its era, but like so gritty. There's that like rough saxophone sound, particularly the party like when they're at the party, and it's just so cool.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite film soundtracks is from favorite like exploitation film soundtracks is from the Robert Rodriguez film Planet Terror, and you can hear the influence of everything Joe Delia did in this film. You can hear it directly on that film, on that music, and I just think it's so cool. It's a good Halloween song. It's a good Halloween.
It is a good Halloween.
Like
it's kind of creepy, yeah.
Yeah, I think because so much of this movie isn't really about the Halloween, but like this is a Halloween movie at the end of the day.
It kind of is, yeah. It kind of works as one.
Yeah, I mean the climax of the film is a bunch of people in Halloween costumes.
It's sort of a slasher film, kind of like Driller Killer in a way.
Yeah,
it's more vigilante, but it is, I think what she becomes is more akin to a slasher in a way. And I totally agree with you about New York in the 80s and the soundtrack. I think it all comes together to really just paint this portrait of this woman and the story, and it's really like a snapshot in time, which I think a lot of these films are, but particularly this one that we're talking about. And I asked you, how does this compare to other cult independent films of this era? And I think that was sort of an unfair question to ask at the beginning of our series, but we're definitely going to come back around to that. By the end of our series, we're going to talk about how all these films that we're discussing in this series, how they all compare and relate to each other. I think it's going to be an interesting journey to go on. And I think starting with this film, Miss 45, I think we're off. I hate to say it, but we're off with a bang. Sorry for the pun, but I had to do it.
There we are.
But yeah, we were off to a great start, and we're really excited for our next one. I'm excited because I've never seen it. And Jeremy, I know you're excited to talk about this one, Eating Raoul. That's our next film that we're going to talk about in this series. And I'm excited to just see it for the first time because I've always heard about it as one of those, independent / cult films that I always wanted to see, and I've never seen it. So I'm excited to watch it and to talk about it on the show. Yeah, definitely. I can't wait. So if you'd like to watch along with us and, listen to our discussion, we really appreciate it. So thanks again for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.